Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. A warm welcome to all. Today's panel focuses on the functions of accelerators in achieving returns at scale. Joining us are Jean-Marc Champagne, the head of environmental finance for WWF, the World Wild Fund for Nature, and Adrian Rimmer, partner and global head of sustainability and ESG at Finsbury Glover Herring. Warm welcome to you both. I am Tricia Purcell, Senior Advisor at the United Nations Development Program, where I work on our nature, climate, energy portfolio. It's a pleasure to be moderating this very timely and important session as we embark on what the UN terms the decade of delivery for the Sustainable Development Goals, which no doubt all of you in the audience have heard of, and the twin decade of ecosystem restoration, which essentially challenges everyone, business, policymakers, people, to massively scale up restoration efforts and investments to reverse biodiversity decline and breathe new life into our natural environment. We want this to be an interactive session and maximize our 30 minutes to hear as many ideas as possible from all of you. So please use the chat to post your comments and questions. To kick us off, I now turn to our distinguished panel to provide us with a few brief opening remarks. Jean-Marc, let me start with you. I think we all have heard the World Economic Forum estimates putting nature loss at the top of its global threat list, estimating that more than half the world's GDP, around $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. More recently, the World Bank, in its sort of first real deep dive analysis of the economic threats, but also opportunities of our natural environment, found that at a conservative estimate, the collapse in nature-based services like wild pollination, the provision of food from marine fisheries, timber from native forests, and so on, could result in a decline of global GDP by 2.7 trillion by 2030. How much investment is needed to not only halt this decline that we're seeing in our ecosystems and biodiversity, but also unlock the dividend potential of our natural world? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. Thanks for that. That's and thanks everyone for listening in, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I think in terms of what we need for investment, it's a situation where we don't really have many alternatives, and we need investment. We're talking about, just to give you some estimations and to use it as a quantifying number. It's not exactly, it's not an exact science in terms of what we need, but if we use the SDGs as a marker, let's say, so we need about 4.2 trillion US dollars a year going into the type of environmental work that we're talking about. And currently we're running at 1.7 trillion. And that sounds like a decent number, actually, when you think about it. But what happens, or what we have there, though, is a $2.5 trillion gap in funding. And somehow we have to figure out how to close that gap. And the issue, what you see is that essentially, in terms of, if you compare that 1.7 trillion, which again, I said, sounds like a decent number when you hear it as a whole, if you compare that to, say, global private sector debt, right? I mean, we're talking about around 185 trillion US dollars. If you look at global listed equities, and these numbers are probably somewhat increased since we look at these estimates, but 90 trillion in global listed equities. Then you look at public debt, which is government led, sovereign debt is about 70 trillion. So we're talking about 1.7 only, which is minimal. Most of that is coming from foundations and philanthropic sources, as well as government development assistance. So we need to figure out how to increase that number. So that's what we need. So and to elaborate a little bit on that, I mean, what we're trying to do at WWF and our Bankable Nature Solutions program is to really, how do we mobilize that capital, the private sector capital, to go into the conservation projects. So I can talk about that a little bit more later, but I'll turn it back over to you, Tricia.
Great, thanks so much, Jean-Marc. And you're making this incredible points where some of these big scary numbers don't seem so big and scary, particularly in the context that you laid out, but also in the context of global recovery in response to COVID. So we're seeing that quite a lot within the work that we're doing across the UN, but also working with our government and private sector partners, where these ones sort of unachievable sums don't seem so unachievable anymore. But Adrian, let me turn to you, and give us you've with your background sort of across I guess different sectors and working with different asset owners and investors, how are we going to sort of mobilize the investment that's that's needed and filling this gap that Jean-Marc just outlined. And I think maybe this will help us sort of identify a few later on some of these bankable projects and other sort of ingredients we need to spur the market. But some initial thoughts from you, Adrian. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Tricia. And again, thank you to everyone who's watching. And I think if you don't think 1.7 trillion is a scary number versus the 4.2 trillion that's needed, I'll give you another much bigger, scarier number, which is the policy gap in gigatons between what is needed to address climate change. And we're talking at the moment of, even at the best scenario that is available, which is a green pandemic recovery, significantly enhanced commitments. You're talking about annual emissions of 41 gigatons to keep us to around 2 degrees. We're currently way over 50, and so we need to get down another 16. Even at the best scenario, there we need an additional 16 gigatons annually reductions to get to 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris goal. So it gives you some sense of how challenging that is in terms of what needs to happen. And so the sums of money needed to support that are commensurate with the size of the challenge. And obviously nature-based solutions in the context of this conference, investments in forestry and biodiversity are a core part of that in terms of driving sequestration. Now, I've been involved in the sort of environmental finance sector broadly for the last 15 years, both on the investment banking side, but also running the gold standard for 5 years, and within that, and really looking at how you develop the tools to give confidence to corporates to invest in these types of solution. And so I've seen firsthand both the efforts and the desire of institutional and investors, corporates, from a philanthropic and a CSR perspective, and now moving into much more of a aligning with their core business perspective, and the sort of wider civil society community wanting to bring together these solutions and wanting to deploy capital. But I've also seen how challenging it is to make that happen. So I think where we are at now, particularly in the context of corporates' net zero commitments and the desire to address their unavoidable emissions, often with investments into forestry, currently often via offsets or direct investments into forestry and some robust measurements around it, we need to start thinking over the long term. Corporates are looking at annual emissions, the kind of gap between what they can reduce and where they need to get to, and they will go into the market, they'll make a grant donation, or they'll buy offsets in the market, and I'm sure you've heard lots about that earlier today, and will continue to do so. But actually, they need to be thinking over the much longer term. These are commitments they're making that will take them to, the next 10, 20, 30 years. Now, when we start aggregating those commitments, we can start thinking in terms of larger scale investment. We can start thinking of aggregating one corporate with another commitment, one corporate with another in terms of their commitment. And so we need a number of things. We need to engage with corporates, and they need to think about working together to pool the investments that they're making. Will make their investments better value. They'll be getting longer term commitments, and a better return on investment in terms of what they're looking for. But they also need the confidence to invest that, and that's confidence both in measurement, it's confidence in the way that those projects are being undertaken. It's confidence that they're not going to get beaten up by the NGO community for claims that they make associated with that, and they really want to have the right guidance. I work within corporates, of course, all sectors now in terms of finance, in terms of the food sector and others, and there is a real desire to get this right. It's not often, though of course it still exists around greenwashing. So I think those sorts of rules. And finally then the vehicles that are needed. And there's a lot of work going into the types of vehicles, whether they be investment fund type structures, whether they be sort of privately managed vehicles working with civil society organization. And so I think we need to experiment and really try to see what works best and what rules need to be put in place.
Great, thanks so much, Adrian. I mean, you've raised so many, key points here. I think, from the activity you're seeing amongst private investors in nature, it's really maybe only ramped up, recently compared to climate change, right? But I think, there's some evidence, right? There's an increasing recognition that nature and climate agendas are actually complementary, that there are economic gains to be had from investments that simultaneously address biodiversity loss as well as climate change. And also to many of your key points, particularly on the confidence and measurement, there's a lot of work that's being done, for example, through the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, which follows the Task Force on Climate-related Disclosure, to not only really account for the financial risks and exposure linked to nature loss that we mentioned at the start of the session, but also really estimate the economic value and investment options of a wide range of ecosystem services and nature-based solutions, carbon sequestration, flood erosion protection, water, and so on. But I think picking up on one of the points that I'd like to sort of throw back to Jean-Marc is where are we sort of in the in the chain of where sort of policy comes in and converges with the investment community. I mean, if we're looking at long-term horizon investors, then maybe also some thoughts for both of you is who are the real target audiences here? Are we only sort of looking at pension funds, institutional investors, insurers, and so on, or can we really look to a wider market, and are there some good examples or signals of that happening? Of course, we've seen some recent big examples, like from the Bezos Earth Fund, which gave quite a sizable grant to WWF. But where are you seeing sort of these conversions and the importance of some of these sort of policy-driven efforts, like TNFD, but that really are aimed at bringing in a broader constitution or constituent of investors? Over to you.
Yeah, I think, there's a good points that a lot that Adrian brought up, and also that you're bringing up as well, Tricia. And I think in terms of policy, I think, it's I hate to say, but it's a little bit, I think policy is behind, and what it needs is, and I think policy regulation, nowhere ever, I guess you can say, does it need it more than this space. And my view is and it has to happen quickly. And there's a lot of, I guess you can say there's still a lot of obfuscation and people pushing back on this, whether it be corporates, individuals, whoever. There's still pushback and there's still obstacles to get around. So I think that has to be addressed. But what has to happen is I guess it kind of comes to a situation where we need a more educated populace on this whole issue, on all these issues, which can then vote or direct either elected officials or non-elected officials in the direction that we need. And we need some real, gutsy decisions on this. There's too much, thinking about it and all this, but the planet and science isn't waiting, right? So we can't, at the end of the day, money and it's all nice, but it doesn't really work when the planet's not functioning and we're dying off. So we really need to get things going in a policy direction. So I think that's to answer your question. I think it's lagging, and we need that. And so right now, I think what we're trying to do, and we are working on the policy level, of course, but from my end and the bankable nature solutions and the work that we're doing, we're driving it more from the bottoms up, and we're trying to press upon the corporates and financial institutions, non-financial institution corporates, that they need to do these things because it's in their best interest. They rely on the resources, they rely on nature for their business, and the risks of not being in line with the planet are huge. So it's existential, actually, to some most businesses. I mean, you look at food, you look at anything, it's really existential threats. So we're trying to point out the economic case of why they need to be. And I think corporates are starting to understand that. Some are slower than others, some are getting it. But it's still, it's still a process that has to happen. But I think, policy, if policy and regulation came in and kind of drove that, it would certainly be, I think, happen much quicker. But we're doing it, again, from the bottoms up and trying to drive this home. And I think a few areas that we, from the private sector, that, we try to, if we're, if we're just looking at it from the bankable nature solution standpoint, where we're trying to get private investment into conservation, into environmental efforts, I mean, it's to me, it really, it's not a difficult equation to kind of talk to them about. I mean, really, these most corporates and companies are dependent on landscapes for their operations in terms of where they do their, or dependent on, I guess you can say, nature for where they do their work. They're linked to the pressures and the risks that are associated with it. So they really need to be involved. So it's absolutely essential that they're getting on board with this. So I think the economic case speaks for itself for them. It's kind of up to us to help bring them along. I mean, we're working on things like you mentioned, the TCFD and then TNFD. TNFD is a little bit more complicated than TCFD because you're talking about it's not as transparent, it's not as clear as it is in TCFD. But I think that's a direction that we're gonna obviously we have to go. But yeah, so we really need to work on both levels. So I don't think we're quite there yet, if that answers your question in terms of policy and where we need to go. We still need a long way, and I think but I think we need both drivers, from the top down and from the bottoms up.
Great, thanks, Jean-Marc. So the session organizers tell us that there's about 144 participants or people watching this right now. So I just want to remind everyone that the floor is open for comments, questions, challenges, debate. So please post your questions or your comments. I'm sure our panelists would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from you, and get the perspective from from the many great people we understand are in the audience watching this session. Adrian, I want to turn back to you and pick up on one of the previous points you made about having confidence, and that includes not sort of being beaten up by NGOs, and I really think it's it's maybe a point that doesn't get discussed often enough, but it maybe an extension of that is how important it is for a company to see themselves in this agenda, and to actually sort of be in a leadership position, because it could seem that, well, this whole sort of, space, at least in the climate side, perhaps maybe now not so much, but starting to, get to that point in the nature side, it is quite a crowded one. So how do you as a corporate, really come in and make a concrete, contribution? Do you have to be sort of the Elon Musk of the world, or a huge multinational, or can you actually come in and find a place and actually, make value to both your company, your shareholders, your employees, but also the planet? Over to you for some thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you say about the size of company. And so just to pick up on something that Jean-Marc said earlier, and it is about companies and individuals giving governments license to legislate and to put in more ambitious policy. And they can do that by showing leadership, by showing that this is something that they're engaged with, that they actively want to address. And the other sort of constituent that's important in this is also the investors. So what we see is from a pension fund's perspective, climate change is a huge risk to their ability to deliver on their fiduciary commitments. And we see increasing engagement by pension funds trying to drive action, both in terms of driving down corporate emissions and ensuring that that's taken care of. And we need to see more focus from the institutional investors, I think, on giving permission or encouraging and engaging with corporates to address the gap between where they are today, where they're going in terms of hopefully highly credible science-based targets and net zero strategies, and where they are now. So filling that gap now, not waiting till 2030, 2040, 2050 to get to those points. And we've seen as part of the Mark Carney task force on scaling voluntary markets, we've seen institutional investor engagement in that process, and we hope to see more of it. But we also see corporates trying to align their business with this. As a pension fund, you have, if you can encourage all of your investee companies to address the gap between where they are today and where they need to be, then that's in aggregate an awful lot of investment. If that's done at a global scale, you start to see the overall risk of climate change to the whole portfolio, so the macro risk that exists in that portfolio, reduced. And the risk to individual companies also reduced. So there's a real reason for that to take place. But it means everyone needs to sort of pull this in the same direction. So what can corporates do? We're seeing direct investments taking place. I worked with a very large conglomerate that is investing in its own large-scale forestry project. And it has the capital to do that. It has the long-term vision, the expectation of regulation that is driving that. It's still very forward-thinking, but it is part of that. At the other end of the spectrum, I was working with a small fast food company relatively recently launching their net zero strategy in their and what was really interesting about that is the way that they really thought about their contribution and how it could be made. What they did was really align support for projects through and offset purchases, but were did that in a really thoughtful way, aligned with a very credible net zero strategy. And they were supporting the communities through projects where they source spices. So there was a real alignment with their values and their purpose as an organization, the products that they were creating, and the communities that they purchase from and partner with to deliver their product. I think that was a really interesting way of engaging at a much smaller level than the big conglomerate with the large-scale forestry investment, in a way that really engages their own customers. And then turn, I think that's incredibly helpful to sort of get the wider message across to the public that corporates are doing these things well, thoughtfully, and that they in turn have a role to play. So I think there's a real cascade of how this needs to operate in practice. But I do think ultimately what we need is the ability for corporates to invest at scale over the long term. And actually, for the most part, they're not going to do that directly with their own projects. They're going to invest in funds or vehicles that will deliver them the emission reductions and biodiversity benefits that they seek. And I think that's a very exciting space that we're very actively working in at the moment as well.
Thanks, Adrian. Very quickly, I just picking up on this, because nature is a big word. It's a lot, and in the same way, I think it took a long time for people, investors, companies, to really sort of get their head around and unpack what climate and climate change and climate related sort of assets look like. Same is now happening in nature. So when we talk about nature, I mean, I think it tends to be a big focus on forestry, for example. I know this at the next session coming up. I think we'll focus on REDD+ and forestry. But what is beyond that? I mean, what are some of these sort of the untapped potential? Where sort of the next new thing or investors should be or corporate should be looking?
Is that to me?
Well, back to Adrian, and then I think Jean-Marc over to you. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the one thing that has been very highly publicized is there aren't enough trees for the commitments that are being made, right? So if we're looking at nature-based solutions, if we're looking at sort of biodiversity, then the obvious next place is the sea and marine-based solutions. There's some really innovative work being done, and it's a much earlier stage than what's been going on in the land-based space. But I think we have to very rapidly develop the capability to measure and implement projects both in coastal regions, which is great because you can support communities through that process and deliver a whole wider range of benefits around erosion, etc., as well as then sort of sequestration activity, but also large-scale activities within the oceans. So I think we need to see some priming of that work with the sort of expert organizations. We need to see that organizations, and there are a growing number of them in the kind of measurement space, satellite technologies, etc., because these are big, open, empty spaces where it's going to be really hard to get robust measurement unless we use the latest technologies. So I think technology providers with relevant solutions need to work with some of the expert NGOs and institutions that are around it, academic institutions, and we need to see a real focus. That will require some quite visionary work from corporates. So actually putting in place long-term bets, if you like, on that opportunity. But it will pay off, I think, ultimately, because that's where we need to be to get, again, I'm sort of dwelling on the sequestration side because I'm slightly concerned that we're not going to get there soon enough. But ultimately, I think that will drive huge benefits. And the sooner we get there, the better.
Great, Adrian, thanks. Jean-Marc, and just a reminder again to our audience, if you have any comments or questions, we have a few minutes left and we'd love to hear from you. Back over to you and back to the overarching theme, of course, of our discussion, which is Accelerator. WWF, I mentioned earlier, received quite a good investment from the Bezos Earth Fund. It, picks up on Adrian's point earlier about, sort of where, companies, investors will be, looking to get, the biggest impact for their investment, and trusted sort of partners and institutions, that they'll be looking to help them make that impact. Tell me where we could sort of see that that acceleration happening, how we really sort of build that, those bankable projects. Is there enough out there in the pipeline? Adrian was just speaking to, example, the marine and ocean-based sort of being as a next untapped potential, but where are we going to see sort of that action? And the final words from you on that to accelerate the session. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great to end with this, because I think it's absolutely crucial. And we did get a big donation from Bezos, but also something bigger and more I think applicable in this case of the bankable conservation is the big fund that we're working with the Dutch Fund for Climate Development, the DFCD. So they, that was, I mean, the Dutch, I have to say, are very pioneering in this sense and very innovative, because the biggest issue or the biggest, I guess you can say, gap that I see that's missing is the funding to incubate these projects. Because when we started this endeavor on the Bankable Nature Solutions, we had many institutions coming to us, private sector all over, looking financial, non-financial, basically saying, we want to invest in this stuff. But there's just not enough partners or not enough projects, and we need partners like WWF to help find them. So what I've been trying to do, and what we're trying to do, is increase beyond the DFCD and get more funding as well. But what the unique thing about the DFCD is that they've filled this, or they're working to fill this gap of project incubation, to build a pipeline of projects that, one, have conservation or environmental impact positively, obviously, have that are investable for investors to scale up the private sector, get them involved. And lastly, they basically get the whole the investability and the scalability and to really get large private sector investment involved in these projects. So that's I think that's what's needed, and that's what we're doing. So we're trying to do that, and we are doing that successfully, bringing multiple projects forward for investment that start with grant capital from either, in the case of the DFCD, it's public sector capital, but we also can look at things with private foundational money and get that to use to mobilize or catalyze private sector investment into these projects. But they all have to have these main three criteria, which is having the positive impact, which is having the business proposition, and then also having the scalability or replicability. Those are all key to driving large private sector investment. And again, it's not just to drive and get the private sector in for the sake of getting the private sector in. It's really to drive the impact on the ground. We can't forget that, because even a lot of the stuff we're doing is a vehicle for the private sector companies and things to do offsets and get involved in conservation. But it's also really the end game is really to have the impact that we need on the ground to drive the change before things get way out of hand, which they seem to be starting to. We're starting to see the beginning of that, scaringly enough.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. And I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that we are out of time. And of course, just as the clock hit the hour, I see some great questions that are coming in that would warrant much more than a 10-second response. So I believe that perhaps we can try to take a minute and see if there's a possibility of addressing at least one question that came in, which is there an interest or an appetite to invest at and within place-based and landscape scale approaches, and within landscapes where forestry work happens, watershed risks emerge, and could and should this be aligned and synergized for nature-related impact? I don't know, Jean-Marc or Adrian, if you want to take 30 seconds and try to do that before we wrap up the session.
If you want, I'll just jump in real quick and just say that the whole approach that we do take is a landscape or seascape approach. It's doing multi-stakeholder mapping, finding out where the ecosystem, where the pressures are on the ecosystems, and then aligning the private sector with that. So we are taking that approach with the Bankable Nature Solutions work that we do.
And I'll just add, I mean, you'll hear a lot more about this in the red session, I'm sure, about the importance of looking at a landscape level. So, you know, but from a corporate perspective, yeah, there is appetite, you know, and I would, you know, there's a desire to be educated, the desire to understand what those opportunities are, and there's a desire to partner to deliver those investments, because, you know, corporates are looking to provide financial support to projects that will allow them to meet their commitments they're making. So, so I think absolutely the answer is yes.
Wonderful. Adrian, Jean-Marc, thank you so much for a great discussion. Thanks to the session organizers for inviting me to be here today as well. It was an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to further following the program today and in future. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning for all. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.